Yay Networks.
I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Holidays can be a mixed bag for so many of us because, sure, we get to catch up and celebrate with family and friends, but then there's the usual stressors of time, finances, family dynamics, and it's really easy to lose sight of the deeper meaning and the spirit of the holidays altogether. It's also not uncommon for the stress of the holidays to derail the focus that we've put into our own wellness. And we've worked really hard to put into our wellness. And this leaves us vulnerable to falling back into those bad habits that many of us have worked just so hard to change. And all of this that I just said, this is in the best of years. It's no secret that 2020 has brought us the added pressures of COVID fears, political differences, divergent opinions on social issues, even the question of whether or not to get together with our entire family this year. That can elicit stressful conversations. And my gosh, if we are, and then we're talking about if it's with or without face covering or distancing protocols, we can feel just incredibly anxious and high stress and just on overdrive before we're even stepping into the holidays. So it's up to us and only us to make the best of whatever our situation may look like this holiday season. And it may not always be easy, but it is more important than ever now to remind ourselves to tune in, to slow down, to take a step back. And what we're going to be talking about on today's podcast is making it a priority to actively incorporate the behaviors that we know enhance our mindfulness, enhance our sense of peace and gratitude. We are joined today by Dr. David Galarneau. He is Vice Chair of Academics and Research in the Psychiatry Department at Ochsner Health. And in his work as an addiction specialist, he's also essentially a behavior change specialist, a psychiatrist, but also works really closely with his patients on guiding them through lasting, sustainable behavior changes. He encourages them and also us to identify what he refers to as chinks in our armor that can leave us feeling vulnerable to destructive behaviors. Destructive behaviors, especially what we'll talk about on this podcast, is around food, alcohol, movement, physical activity, or lack of it, and these other key elements of our self-care that can really go out the window whenever we're stressed, but combine that with the normal stresses of holiday season, plus what we're already experiencing this year. Dr. Galarneau has actually joined me before in a podcast about the science of alcohol on our mind, body, and spirit. If you haven't listened to it, scroll back into the podcast library. It was earlier in 2020, I believe around March of 2020. And he's a wealth of knowledge. I also really admire his ability to connect with us in ways that are relevant and meaningful. He talks about behavior change, but he really breaks down, quote, behavior change, which is, it's easy to say it, but it can feel nearly impossible to do it. So he helps us really break down this concept of behavior change into manageable pieces that make sense for us, meeting us wherever we are on our journey and on the spectrum of wellness and change. So with that, welcome, Dr. Galarneau. I'm excited to have you with us. Thank you for carving out the time to join us again.
Thanks, Molly. It's my pleasure. And, as always, feel free to call me Dave.
Well, thank you. I do when we're talking offline, so I appreciate the green light for this. And I feel like you are a Dave. You're so, while you are a physician and you're expert in so many ways and so many things that we'll be talking about, the way that you connect with people, I think, is truly in a very intimate way with your patients, and that you encourage and invite people to be very open, very expressive. And I think that's much more something that someone's going to talk with their friend Dave about than saying Dr. Galarneau. So I totally see that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
So with your work as an addiction specialist, you are working closely with patients, inpatient, also outpatient. And it's usually drugs, alcohol would be the usual addictions I'm assuming that you're working with. But those same behaviors that you're guiding people through and behavior change really translates beautifully to our behaviors around food, exercise, habits that we're developing, and alcohol, even if we are not in a place that maybe someone is requiring inpatient or outpatient treatment, it might still be problematic for us. And so the expertise that you bring can really resonate with us in all of these areas of our life.
Yeah, I think, that when we're working with people with addiction, we're really trying to tap into motivation, behavior change, and that really is applicable in a lot of different domains and areas, not just addiction. So we try to use some of those broader techniques from the work with addiction just to help people in general with healthy habits. And
when we're talking about holidays coming up, so as you and I are recording this, it is, I just realized, Friday the 13th, November 13th. Yeah. And people are really now starting to talk about what are we going to do for holidays? What is it going to look like this year? And really, I think any year you and I could do this podcast and it's relevant because the holidays in our best of years can be incredibly stressful for people. There's family stressors, there's travel, there's financial stressors. The holidays are a time that I find with many clients, they may have been on their A game, they've been rocking along, everything is spectacular, and then things just get completely derailed with holidays for a variety of reasons. And this year, it's that times 1,000. Yes, I agree that, this, as you said, can be a real time for people when they can trip up, when they've done a good job through the year of setting up new behaviors and habits. And I think this year it's even going to be potentially even more problematic. So let's start with what that even means. When people say things are stressful, of course, that definition of what stress feels like is very different for a lot of people. But what are some of just the typical stressors that people are experiencing, and how do we cope with these? How do these look? How do these coping mechanisms look different for people? Sure. I think stress is a pretty broad concept. Basically, when we're talking about stress, we're talking about how the brain and our body responds to any demand. Stress, it's actually an evolutionarily helpful process. For instance, if you're walking in the woods and you see something slithering by you, it's important that your body and your brain activate in a certain way to keep yourself safe. And so stress, can be broken into a variety of different types of stress. Some are sort of more mundane, or routine stress, things like pressures involved with school or work or family. Stress can also be brought on by big, sudden negative changes, like a divorce or an illness or a death. And then also, in its most extreme form, traumatic stress. If someone, is assaulted, or, we see in natural disasters or wars, there's a variety of stressors. I think also when you think about stress, the thing that's important to think about is that evolutionarily and ideally, the system works for short, acute incidents. So meaning, like I said, if you're walking in the woods and you see a snake slither by, you want to activate this system, this fight or flight, this adrenaline. It kind of keeps you safe, but then the system should shut itself off. And what can happen when people are subject to chronic stress, and I think, unfortunately, with what we're dealing with the pandemic, where this has been going on now for 10 months, and the stressors kind of remain, is that system can get activated multiply and have difficulty turning off, and then that can multiply for people and can cause a lot of problems. So I think as we head into this holiday season, we have to be very cognizant and aware that, in a given year, people kind of enter a holiday season having, had periodic stressors through the year. But the bulk of people, unfortunately, this year are entering the holiday seasons with having more of a higher basal chronic level of stress.
heading in, and so they're already kind of tweaked. Their adrenaline system is already kind of revved up from the year, and that's sort of the whole new wrinkle as we head into this season.
So when we talk about kind of in normal times, and I know we'll talk also kind of what is just so different this year, but in normal times, when we think about the stressors that come up, personally, I guess years ago, I made a very conscious decision to discontinue the use of the phrase, "I'm so stressed." I don't say it. I share that with my team. If they want to say it, it's their choice if they want to say, "I'm so stressed," but I share with them the why. And I think it does resonate because when we say, or just a blanket, "I'm so stressed," it's not very definitive. It doesn't really define, it doesn't express really how we're feeling. Are we feeling fearful instead? Are we feeling lonely or overwhelmed? Or what is this that we're actually feeling? And I feel like if we just say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so stressed," number one, it doesn't really identify what we're really feeling. And I want to get your feedback on that. But then the other is that it is almost like if you state it like that, then it's really easy for someone to almost just sweep it under the rug and then not address what those feelings are.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, stress is a very broad category. And I think sometimes we tend to sort of pigeonhole in the negative aspects of stress. But stress, as I said, is a normal function. It's evolutionarily important. There are good types of stress, and feeling somewhat heightened, and for instance, you have a big event you need to get ready for, you have a test or something like that. Having a little bit of stress to keep you on track, to keep you on pace is not a bad thing. And so I think that can kind of get lost in the shuffle for some folks, and trying to be mindful of that, that it's not just a negative thing that we have to deal with. It can become negative if it becomes outsized or if we are not thoughtful about it.
And I think that's why I chose to stop using that phrase, because I felt like it was giving whatever that feeling was more power, more than really what it deserved, versus me really addressing it. And so, because I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say, "I am so stressed," and they mean it in a positive way. And I hear what you're saying, that stress can keep us on our toes. It keeps us on our A game. It keeps us driving forward and pushing forward. But most people are going to refer to it in the negative. And so that's just something that, if that helps our listeners, it just kind of is reframing the messaging that we're telling ourselves. And this year, even though we're saying that about, being mindful of using the word stress or whatever these things are that we're kind of telling ourselves, I think it's something for us to talk about there is a legitimate, our feelings are very valid this year. Whatever we are feeling that might be, less than ideal, whether we feel stressed or we feel fearful or we feel angry about things, uncertain, these are very valid feelings because COVID, and then there's the political climate. There's the question of, well, gosh, do we get together with our family like we usually do for these particular holidays? Or do we get together with our friends? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? And there's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think that uncertainty leaves a lot of people feeling really stressed, really, Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, we do, physiologically have, as I said, because this has been chronic over the last 10 months, we have these certain hormones in our body that are running around at different levels than they normally are. And that just feeds into things as well. So I think we need to be mindful of that, people's adrenaline levels have been running at a bit higher rate than normal.
What happens with that? How does that manifest itself? What does that look like when that's happening, or feel like when that's happening?
Sure. So, when we're talking about adrenaline, it's sort of the classic fight or flight. And so it's things like your heart beating a bit faster, breathing more heavily, sweating. You can have sometimes feeling a bit dizzy, or it's that feeling, when you get, like I said, like say, you're walking in the woods and you see a snake, that
Right.
all those things that kind of happen to you, that's adrenaline. And, we're aware of really what it feels like in acute settings when you really get frightened. But you can have some of those in a more subtle way that are just kind of churning along. There are other hormones involved as well, cortisol, and an interesting thing is, we think of cortisol as a stress hormone, and it is, but actually what we've kind of learned, which was surprising to us looking at patients with PTSD, is that chronically, patients who undergo chronic stress, their cortisol levels actually drop. And cortisol, in addition to being a stress hormone, also helps regulate the sympathetic system. And so when the levels drop, it has, the sympathetic system does not turn off in the way it should. So paradoxically, lower chronic cortisol levels, that you might think that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing. So, we know physiologically we have these aberrations now going around in our body, potentially when we move from acute to chronic stress. And that, I think is something that we all need to be aware of when we're thinking about ourselves, but also when we're dealing with other people as well. And making sure that we, give people the benefit of the doubt at times, try to pause and take a second if something comes off a bit off color from someone, to be empathetic and, okay, I'm assuming maybe they're having a hard time the way that I potentially have a hard time, during this. And that can help people a lot, I think.
I'd like to take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors for this week's episode, Headspace. So life can be stressful even under normal circumstances. 2020, as we've been talking about in this episode, has challenged even the most difficult times of life. We need stress relief that goes beyond quick fixes, and that's where Headspace can help. Headspace is your daily dose of mindfulness in the form of guided meditations in an easy-to-use app. It is one of the only meditation apps advancing the field of mindfulness and meditation through clinically validated research. So whatever the situation, Headspace really can help you feel better. If you're overwhelmed, there's a 3-minute SOS meditation for you. If you need help falling asleep, Headspace has some wind down sessions that members swear by. Headspace's approach to mindfulness can help to reduce stress, improve sleep, boost focus, and increase our overall sense of well-being. I really love that as a user of Headspace, you can select what's really important to you at this moment right now. Do you want to focus on better focus? Or do you want to focus on reducing anxiety? Do you want to focus on better sleep? So you choose what's important to you, and Headspace guides you through this. You deserve to feel happier, and Headspace is meditation made simple. Go to headspace.com/fueled. That's headspace.com/fueled for a free 1-month trial with access to Headspace's full library of meditations for every situation. This is the best deal offered right now. Head to headspace.com/fueled today. So this chronic stress leaving us feeling the increased heart rate, breathing rate, those things that we can physically feel. And then I would imagine that's, translates to interfering with our sleep, having a little bit of a shorter fuse or shorter temper. And recognizing that in ourselves, as you said, I think it's really easy for us to try to recognize it in others, but we see it in others maybe before we see it in ourselves. But, there's nothing wrong. We're going to slip up. We're going to say things that maybe we regret, or gosh, that sounded a little harsh coming out. And I think it's completely okay to go back to that person, or when you do realize that, to say, hey, that sounded a little harsh. Here's what I meant. And being real forthcoming.
And in addition to it, exactly what you said, in addition, not just, effects, say, on sleep, but also when our sympathetic system is sort of on overdrive, we can have a hyper alertness, a state of alarm, a sensitivity to threat, this phenomenon of sort of startling easily, catching things out of the corner of your eyes.
Yeah.
And so people are kind of in that state where they're a bit revved up. And so a harsh word, particularly affects them or oneself more than usual. And I think being aware of that, people are a bit, for lack of a better word, more, they're jumpier than usual. That's this phenomenon that we see.
Right. I walked into my house, and I know Brad, my husband, is home. It's no secret, his car is outside. He was there when I left. So I go for a walk. I come back. I mean, clearly he's there. And I don't know if it's what you're saying or if I'm in my own thoughts, or maybe it's a combination of both. But I have walked in and then turned the corner and he's right there and jumped and the jump and gasp. And he's like, hey, yeah, I know you're surprised I'm here, sarcastically. And it's this, it's ridiculous. And it's, some in my own head. And I'm sure it's some of just that, that we are a little bit more on edge. Talk to us about how this affects our food, our eating habits, our behaviors with alcohol. A lot of times people just, especially through the year, January on, or really they have these wellness goals, or, it may have been years plural that people have really been successful in making these lifestyle changes when it comes to food, alcohol, physical activity. What happens with this chronic stress that can really start to unravel these healthy behaviors that we've layered in?
Sure. So, our understanding of addiction and the neurophysiology, so to speak, of addiction has really grown over the last decade or so. And, everyone's fairly familiar with the reward aspects of addiction, in that, you use a drug or you engage in a behavior and it sort of increases pleasure in your brain, so to speak, and you get a high. And so, some folks, based on their genetics and the way that their brain works, that high is a little bit different for them and harder to resist, and that can lead down an addiction pathway. But now we also understand that there's other brain pathways that feed into that. And one of them is the fact that when you are experiencing a lot of negative emotions or feelings, a way to escape those, at least temporarily, is through some of these behaviors. For people with addiction, it's using alcohol or using the drug. But for other folks, they can get a milder version of that from engaging in behaviors that just sort of increase the reward pathway a bit. So, for instance, food. So, if we're talking about people who are under chronic stress, they've got these hormones running around. They've got a higher level, say, of adrenaline. They maybe got their cortisol levels down a little bit or up, depending on how chronic or acute the stress is. And so that's, tilting their brain towards more negative emotions. And, they eat something high in sugar or high in fat. It can tap into that reward pathway in your brain, and that gives you a brief sense of relief. And so that can be very tempting to do. It's a way to escape those negative feelings for a short period of time.
There's actually been studies that show that carbohydrate, and especially carbohydrate paired with salt and fat, light up, and the way that it's usually described is they light up the same or similar receptors in our brain that are impacted by drugs like cocaine. So when someone says that they feel like they crave these things, or they feel like they're having a compulsion for this, there's physiological things happening that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, so the pathway that we're referring to specifically is a pathway in the brain. Just to get a little scientific for a second, it goes from an area called the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. And there is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is basically the reward neurotransmitter in our brain. And so, when we have rewards, whether it be food or sex or drugs or alcohol, we have an increase in dopamine in our brain. And this kind of leads us to feel that high or that pleasure. And so definitely certain types of foods, especially foods, as you mentioned, high in carbohydrates, in salt, can tap into this pathway and kind of hijack that response. The other thing that we know from addiction science is that when we are anticipating a reward, So, for instance, someone say who has an issue with alcohol and say they typically drank on a Friday night. As Friday night comes along, their brain in that pathway actually releases a little bit of dopamine in anticipation of knowing that a reward is probably soon to follow. And that's what can cause the cravings. And so the same thing can happen to us. If we know, okay, a holiday party is coming and there's going to be a lot of sugary or high-fat food there, our reward pathway in anticipation of that can secrete a little dopamine, which primes the pump, so to speak, and really gets us craving and makes it a little bit, not a little bit, even a lot harder to resist during those times. So we have to be prepared for that. That times in the past where we had these kind of rewards, we're going to have a harder time. So going into a party, we should expect I'm probably going to be more tempted to eat foods I shouldn't eat, and making adjustments to try to counteract that as best we can.
I'd like to take a bit to share about Nutrafol, sponsor for this week's podcast episode. Nutrafol is designed to support the growth of thicker, fuller hair from the inside out. You've heard me say it when it comes to skincare, hair care. I am a big rules follower. I am very consistent with what I do, following the specific recommendations of my dermatologist. So when I talked with her about Nutrafol, she said, not only does she recommend it to her patients, she uses it herself. Nutrafol, it's a physician-formulated nutritional supplement made with potent botanicals. So in addition to things that we can do like backing off of damaging styling tools and heat and chemicals, supplementing with Nutrafol helps to support healthier hair from within. You can grow thicker, stronger hair and support our show by going to Nutrafol.com using promo code FUELED to get 20% off. This is their best offer anywhere, plus free shipping on every order. So get 20% off at Nutrafol.com, promo code FUELED. Their best offer anywhere, 20% off, Nutrafol.com. That's spelled Nutrafol.com, promo code FUELED, for hair as strong as you are. So there's a lot at play that works against us. I also think that there's something to, like you were saying, when we are experiencing these negative feelings, whatever that feeling is, whether it's, again, fears or frustration or maybe anger that, our family doesn't agree with us on certain things, whether it's politically or any of the stuff. And there's just a lot that comes out. Well, these negative feelings that we're feeling, the foods that we eat cause this release of dopamine, trigger this release of dopamine. Then there's also just the simple distraction, that hand to mouth or spoon to mouth, whatever it might be. Just that act of eating for that split second is a distraction from whatever is swirling through our heads, combined with the physiological effect of those carbohydrates once they're hitting us and that dopamine release. So there's a lot happening here. So when we think, wow, it's challenging during the holidays and the best of years because we have a lot more opportunity eating and drinking, and there's a lot more events that might interfere with our normal wellness routines and exercise. That's in a year. That is in a year. And now when we look at these things, and as you said, kind of this increased threshold, this increased baseline of stress that most of us are experiencing, we really have to be proactive and almost, would we say, almost kind of like going into it, looking almost like, I don't want to say defensively, but how would you guide someone what's the first things that we start to do when we're looking at, okay, how can I not let this completely unravel me?
Sure. So I think, one step is just first being aware. When we work with patients with addiction, we try to help them look for what we call triggers. So what are the things that are most likely going to potentially throw you off track? Some of those are, as we will label those cues, like I mentioned before, people, places, and things like that Friday night where someone usually drank on that night, or say it's an LSU game or a Saints game, or sometimes it can be an object or a person that they would drink or use with. So we try to get people to look at those times because we know those are going to trigger people, that anticipatory sort of surge of dopamine when you get around those people or those places or things that will increase the cravings. So recognizing that that's likely going to happen, and then trying to come up with plans. Sometimes, the plan is we just avoid those situations. Sometimes that's not possible, and then we try to work with people about raising the defenses, so to speak, during those times. So what if you do have a craving? Well, what does that mean? How can I work through that? Recognizing that cravings come, but they go. They're temporary. And, we have techniques that we work with people about, there's something called euphoric recall, where our brain tends to remember the good side of things much more than the negative side of things. And so, for instance, when it comes to a sweet snack, it's much more easy to remember the taste and, the temporary kind of pleasure that you got. You have to more walk yourself through, okay, well, now let's think about the negative. I've been really working hard on my diet or my exercise. And then maybe the next morning I've eaten too much and I don't feel good. So actively reminding yourself of some of the negative side effects, or, we call that sort of playing the tape forward, looking at, okay, so you do this, then this, then this, then this happens. And so those are some of the techniques I think that we can use. Another thing that can happen sometimes to people is if you do say have a slip, sometimes that can really snowball into just, almost a full scale retreat. Like, okay, so what's the point? I've started eating things I shouldn't be eating, or I've stopped going to the gym, so I might as well just go with it, and really getting thrown off your routine. And we try to, the less harsh you are with yourself, the more forgiving. Okay, you know what? I kind of fell off the mark, but it was just one time. Let me get back on the wagon, so to speak. All is not lost. Having confidence and, like I said, just being forgiving of yourself, that can really help people as well. There's some data, for instance, that, programs that really are very harsh on, say, any kind of slip tend to do worse than programs where they encompass that and they work with people instead.
So the progress, not perfection.
Exactly. Yeah. And, when we talk with people, we talk a lot about relapse prevention. And, we can use some of that language when we're talking about behaviors. And what we really try to stress to people is if you have a relapse. So in this particular case, we're using that loosely when what we mean is, say, you engage in a behavior that you were trying to avoid, like overeating or eating certain types of foods or getting away from a diet, that usually that this is a process and not necessarily an event. Or it can be both, that, you were doing things, you were kind of going down a pathway that led you to that. And then, when we work with people, say, who have a relapse, we go back and we sort of look at what happened. We can see signposts along the way where, I noticed you did this. You stopped going to meetings, or you stopped meditating, or, you got away from talking to these people, or you started hanging out in places that put you at risk. And then all these things sort of add up and then ultimately can lead to the relapse. So being aware of, we talk about recovery versus relapse. It's really a continuum. People are either moving towards relapse or moving more securely into recovery, and recognizing that's an active process. And what are we doing to make sure we're moving in the right direction?
And which comes back to, as you mentioned earlier, these triggers, these people, places, things that you're choosing to spend your time with or put your energy toward, that are either getting you closer to your goal of wellness or pulling you further from it.
Exactly. And some people have labeled these things as, and I really like this quote, I'm reading this off, it's not my own words, apparently irrelevant decisions. So this idea of these sort of mini decisions over time each of which brings us closer to a high risk situation or problematic behavior. So things that, if we look at them just on their own, they don't seem to be major issues. But when we add them all up together, they ended up leading us back to that behavior that we were trying to avoid. And so if we can intervene early and catch it, we can have an impact on that.
I even think about the places that people are lured in. A lot of times it's, the seemingly innocent place like a Rite Aid, and that's where they're going to get their fix of choice, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or sugar, the candy aisle there. But you may say, okay, well, I need to get Tylenol, and then the choice of where you're going to stop can really, it seems like who cares where you're going to pick up your Tylenol, but it can matter because what other things are going to be in your path there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love that though. So it's apparently irrelevant decisions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they seem to just completely not even matter if you looked at them in a vacuum, but threaded together, woven together, they're really starting to tell the story of where we end up. Right.
And when we talk about just people, places, and things, I had a patient once who I was working with. He said something that really just stuck with me, and it just, I think, drove the point home even more for me. And he said, if you hang out in a barber shop, you're going to get a haircut eventually. So if you're putting yourself in positions, like I've had patients who said, well, I'm just going to go to the bar and I'll get my Coke. I'm just going to have a Coke. I'm just going to, well, you know what? You go there long enough, probably one time it's going to be a beer instead of a Coke that you order. And so, we can really set ourselves up for success, or we can really make it a much more challenging climb by putting ourselves in positions where we have opportunities to give into moments of weakness.
That's huge too when we're talking about holidays. And one of the most basic kind of fundamentals that we talk about in self-care and getting your game plan together for holidays under normal years is, bring a dish, bring something to whatever you're going to be doing. Or if you're going to be celebrating at home a little bit more, make sure that you're preparing a lot of foods that are truly nourishing, and maybe pick just one or two things that are really a splurge and really kind of not the norm or not particularly nutritious or specifically not nutritious. But when we do say, during holidays, oh, I'm going to bring, 5 different pies to this event, or I'm going to have these around the house, we are setting ourselves up to eat those pies. Or non-holiday time, well, I like to have Oreos around for the kids or whatever. Who's really eating them, And so what are the things that we're surrounding ourselves with or bringing with us or planning to have? So I think that's a very basic thing in holidays is plan to surround yourself with nourishing choices, and the people around us are going to be grateful for that as well. And that's a real basic that we haven't even kind of talked about, but that is something that as we're looking at how are you insulating yourself and protecting yourself, and those things that are those really small things that make add up to those big life stories. The other is staying, and we're getting into I have more that I want to back up in a second, but the other is as much as possible staying on your normal schedule, no matter what that means. And it might mean that you have to say no to certain things, but if you usually meet a friend for a morning walk, trying to continue to do that. And, if that means maybe you arrive at something 30 minutes later, or you're not able to, whatever it is, but still trying to get these things in your life that bring you peace, they bring you balance, and they're those things that are getting you closer to your wellness goals.
Yeah, and I think that can be what sometimes is difficult about the holidays is that there are more events, and it is easier to get thrown off of your schedule. And there's just more to do, and so it's easy and tempting to be like, well, I'll just skip this, or I'll get back to this later. But these things that we do daily or weekly, for wellness, whether they be exercise or walks or meditation, they really help ground us. And so as much as possible, keeping these anchor points, I think can really help us stick to the healthy routines that we've set up. And something else I wanted to add when you were talking is that struck me is I think we also need to be very deliberate and have a plan when it comes to maintaining our healthy habits. I think if as we were talking about, well, we can bring this dish or that dish, because I think if you just kind of show up and you haven't thought things through, you're much more likely to kind of get carried away on a whim. And I've talked to some of my patients about this idea. People who've struggled with addiction, they often end up making bad decisions, or they really kind of do things they really regret in order to access or use their substance of choice. And I talk about the fact that just the way in the past you schemed to use, you need to scheme for your recovery. You need to think about, where are my weaknesses? Where are my triggers? What can I put in place here? This might be a potential issue, so I'm going to counter it in this way. And, the more that you're deliberate about that, the more likely you are, I think, to have success. If you just leave it up to chance and, winging a prayer, that often falls short for people.
I think that's a really great point. On the topic of what we're bringing, a lot of times we think, okay, I'm going to bring a dish, and that might be a dessert, a sweet treat. I'm actually bringing this year, we have to my dad's, we have a cauliflower risotto. It's a Parmigiano Reggiano and wilted spinach and cauliflower rice, but it's this risotto. It's actually from our Eat Fit cookbook, but it's from this incredibly talented chef, a restaurant called Dakota on the North Shore. It is one of my favorite side dishes ever. And now our cafe at the fitness center makes it, and they're offering it by the quart for Thanksgiving. I'm like, sign me up, because that to me is like a win-win. I'm like, I'm not making it. I can bring it. It's really delicious. It's a perfect thing for holiday. And it's not like I'm bringing just a vegetable tray, like it's something that's like really indulgent. And the same for drinks. A lot of times you can show up to someone's house and your option might be water or sweet tea. And then you go, okay, well, I'll do water. Well, then you kind of feel like, it feels a little bit like punishment. Like when there's all these other options there, but you're kind of relegated to that, or alcohol or other sugary soft drinks. And so bringing your own little, ice chest, or bring in enough to share with others of, if you like the flavored sparkling waters or whatever that might be, so you've got something that you're going to enjoy as well. And then, let's say it is with your family and everybody's got their wine glasses, pour that into a wine glass. You don't need to have your can while everybody else has their cocktail glasses or wine glasses, So finding ways, but that, like you said, it isn't going to just happen, and you don't want to just show up and then think, oh, wait, what am I going to do with this? Kind of anticipate and plan as if it won't be there. And then what you're bringing, others can benefit from as well. So let's talk a little bit about the stressors this year specifically, because I think, it's like this elephant in the room for everybody, but there's the exhaustion of, the months and months that we've been dealing with COVID. And actually you and I right now are doing this by phone, and we were going to be doing it in person, across the dining table, 6-foot distance, which is easy. But my husband and I actually, as we speak, are in quarantine. We had a high exposure. And so even you and I now in November, we were warned that the numbers would pick back up as cooler weather came, and it looks like that's happening. And so it's a very real concern for people of, do I or don't I? And you and I both work for Ochsner Health, and we have a policy, and with Ochsner, we've been all asked to not have holiday get-togethers, either, especially outside, because then that brings in spouses, it brings in that, and it stinks. We really want to do that with our teams and our coworkers, but that's something that makes it we don't have to wonder or guess or make this decision, do we, don't we, because that policy is sort of already in place. But on a personal level, everyone is kind of deciding, and within a family, there can be very mixed ideas of what should happen. And so you have some in the family that think, well, there's nothing holding us back. Let's all get together like we usually do. Then there's others who might have a much more conservative approach. And then that can cause a divisiveness, which further increases our stress levels.
Yeah. And, I think we've spent some time talking about how, this holiday season, we think about events and how they could be more stressful. But, also these events can be very healing and helpful. And so the fact that we're going to have to, miss or severely curtail these activities in this holiday season, is another stressor. As you mentioned, Auctioner has a policy where they've asked us all not to, gather for departmental parties. The CDC has just issued guidelines saying that they, don't recommend that you celebrate with people outside of your household. And so there's going to be also on top of this chronic stress, this sense of loss and these activities that we normally really looked forward to engaging in, we're not going to get a chance to do those in the same way. For some of us, these events, we may not get to see these people at other times. For instance, I'm not originally from New Orleans, from upstate New York, and I usually would get a chance to see my parents every couple months, and haven't got a chance to see them since last January, and
Wow.
Unfortunately, will not be seeing them for this holiday season. And so this is I'm a little bit of a mama's boy. This is the longest I've ever gone without seeing my mom, and so that's really difficult to think about that. And we head into the season how Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever holiday you celebrate, is going to be different this year. It's going to be different for me, and I assume it's going to be different for most of the people listening to this out there as well.
So finding ways that we can accept that to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And also trying to, you have a choice with these things where you can focus on the loss and the things you're missing out on, or you can try to focus on the positive side, I'm thankful that I have these people in my life to begin with. And maybe I take that for granted some years and don't think as much about that and can get caught up in the politics, whether it's national or just family politics. And somehow, big events like this have a way of hopefully getting us to think about the reason that we're celebrating these holidays even to begin with. And what's important and what's extra. And maybe this is a chance for us to get back to those roots a little bit, about, hey, why do we even bother to get together on Thanksgiving or on Christmas or Hanukkah? What is the meaning behind that, and how that becomes even more important for us, in this season?
I'd like to pause for a minute to talk about our sponsor for this week's episode, Sweaty Betty. So there is no better time to take your fitness to the next level. And right now, every bit of motivation counts, like a sweet new pair of London's most popular Sweaty Betty Power leggings. No other athletic brand can compete with the Sweaty Betty Power Leggings squat-tested compression fabric and expertly placed seams that physically shape and lift our core and our glutes. They are quick drying with a perfectly placed little side pocket. You can take their quiz at sweatybetty.com to find your perfect style and choose from a wide selection of strategically cut patterns. I love Sweaty Betties. You will love them too. They are buttery soft with really great patterns. So now through November 30th, get 20% off your entire purchase when you visit sweatybetty.com/fueled and enter code FUELED at checkout. This is the best offer Sweaty Betty has available anywhere, because no matter how hard we're training, Sweaty Betty makes it effortless to look and feel amazing before, during, and after your workout. Get 20% off your entire purchase at sweatybetty.com/fueled only until November 30th. That's spelled SWEATYBETTY.com/fueled and enter code FUELED at checkout. So as you're talking, it made me think, when we do have these large gatherings, ultimately, it's a beautiful thing to spend time with our families. But at the same time, let's be honest, we all know the people who are hosting these a lot of times, it's not a smooth, seamless thing. They have a lot of frustrations. They have a lot of pressures they're putting on themselves to get the house ready, to get everything just so, because they're going to be entertaining for 20 or more people or whatever that might be. And so there are a lot of, as you said, like extras and kind of to-dos and a production made about it that maybe aren't integral to it. And if we are doing it on a smaller scale, a smaller level, still finding ways that we can make it really special. And so whether it's people in your immediate household or your immediate family, still bringing a lot of these traditions in, I think is really important. And not just having Thanksgiving isn't just like your normal Thursday, still make it special within this. And then we should say the CDC guidelines, they do recommend, as Dave said, planning to spend Thanksgiving with people from within your household, specifically. The guidelines, if you are going to be spending holidays, and we'll take it beyond Thanksgiving, but holidays with people outside of your household, they do recommend for everybody to wear a mask. And that's the facts. And we see the numbers go down when people wear a mask. But the reality is, a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people are resistant to it. People in your family may be resistant to it. They may, quote, not believe in it. Their political views may have them, anti-mask. And then that brings up that whole discussion. And so just even saying the simple thing of, okay, well, if we are going to get together, wear a mask, that can feel weird to people. And so if you are getting together, we encourage you to have those conversations with people ahead of time to set those expectations. And, if you are getting together with that larger extended group, kind of just like if you're going to be bringing whatever your food or your drink is, so you've got something healthy to fall back on and you're not surprised when you get there, having these conversations before you get there as well. Hey, is there going to be space outside? Or let's plan to have some space outside where people can be and not having just everybody inside. Or do we have a plan for distancing? Making sure that there's certain things in place, but that especially within families, we know how that is, whether it's brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, we know that there's a lot of times power struggles and the family dynamics, and that can be a challenge to have these conversations. But I think if those things are discussed ahead of time, that can make it a lot easier and more peaceful day of. It might be a conversation you're dreading, but putting our head in the sand is only going to make it worse day of. So I'd encourage to at least ask these questions and start those conversations. You and I were reviewing them a little bit, the guidelines, and bringing your own food, which you can definitely do. Bring your own food. We were just talking about bringing your nutritious options, but bringing your own plates, cups, and utensils. I don't know, Dave, if I would bring my own plates, cups, and utensils. I mean, if we're going to my dad's for Thanksgiving, I can just say it. I'm going to be using their flatware and plates.
It's going to be difficult with some of these things for sure.
Yeah.
It's going to feel awkward. I think though, this maybe hopefully to some degree having something like this to point to, it's you can say it's not just me. I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. You can go and you can see this online where these recommendations are coming from. And I think linking it up to the fact that, things are getting a bit worse, unfortunately, as we head into the fall and the winter, and we can see the numbers rise. I think, as you said, with some families, people are going to be on the same page, and this isn't going to be an issue. But if you are anticipating that these conversations could be difficult, then I do think having them beforehand is really key. And we talked about how just like in terms of avoiding behaviors, being deliberate, having a plan can make you more successful. This is the same thing. If you think about it ahead, you have a plan of how you're going to address it. You do it up front. I think it almost always goes much smoother than if you just wait to the day of and see how it goes while you're there. And so I would really encourage people to be deliberate around that. Some of the other guidance we all know, but just bears repeating. We should try to stay 6 feet apart from people that we don't live with in our household. We definitely want to be washing hands. very frequently and using hand sanitizer. If we don't want to be sharing food, we may need to think about how that would work in terms of, communal snacks and things like that. And travel is going to be another biggie, if possible, driving, and thinking about maybe also doing celebrations outside of the normal times. We were talking offline, Molly, before we started about how some people, who do traditional sort of family events, but then also have Friendsgiving, maybe are going to be positioning one of those at a different time to give some space in between them to try to reduce risk of transmission. So
exactly. I think keeping in mind a lot of people's family involves, parents who may be older, grandparents who may be elderly, they're going to be at higher risk. And so if you are a Friendsgiving or, whatever holiday it is, and you do something that's with your friends, maybe say the night before that typical holiday, pushing that back 1 week after, let everybody, really be safe, really be tight with things if you are going to be exposed to family, and then have that family time, and then have your Friendsgiving with these parameters. We also, there was I shared with you, Dave, there's a really great article I thought on Thrive Global. I'll link to it in our podcast notes. 10 conversation starters that have nothing to do with politics, because when we are talking about the family dynamics there, and you may be frustrated with certain things and people don't see the things the way you do and you can't understand it, and what are some of the things that can just completely not be related to that. And so they have specific questions, specific examples, but what are you passionate about? What is something you've been doing lately that you're really proud about? What do you learned about yourself in 2020 with all of this COVID quarantine? These are things that are, what are you grateful for right now? These are things that really can start conversations about each other and help us learn about each other, because ultimately that's what it all comes down to. The holidays are about, celebrating the holiday, the reason we have this holiday in the first place, and then also our family. And we forget about that because we're so caught up in, what's the food going to be? Where are we going to have it? What's the table decorations looking like? What's the decorations on the door going to be? But really what matters is what's happening with the people in that room. And so I think making sure we're keeping that top of mind when we are with whoever we decide to spend our holidays with.
And I think, and even taking a step back from that with going in with a positive mindset, as much as possible, instead of thinking the dread, how's this going to work out? I know me and Uncle Jim don't agree on this or that. The positive, why you're in with these people, why you want to spend time with them, the fact that, you share this common history, this common bond, and then it's been a hard year, and that, it's quite possible, you may not have made it to the end of the year together, but now you're here you're here together and you have another opportunity to be with each other. And you really want to find out what's going on with them and catch up, because you don't get a chance to see them in the same way as you did before. I think that will guide the conversations as well. I just wanted to also make sure people, we talked about the CDC guidelines, but please go and look at them. You can find them on cdc.gov.
I'll link them for us as well. Yeah.
And take a look, because we want you to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information around that, what people are recommending. And we know it is going to be an imposition and a change to people's actions and routines, but there's reasons why we recommend these things, and we want everyone to be as safe as possible.
As you're saying, we're talking about kind of the really talking with the people that we're spending that we are choosing to spend that time with, that we end up spending our holidays with, and really kind of getting underneath what's all this surface stuff that's happening right now, and really getting into what's happening in their world, what's happening with them. That's also easier to do when it's a smaller gathering. If you've got your group of 4 people or 6 people versus 36 people, it becomes a lot more reasonable to think that we can do this without, without so much. So I do think while we may miss some of those larger gatherings, if we're not doing it or choosing not to, can't do it for whatever reason, we are going to miss a lot of elements of that. But I think just like Dave was saying, look to see what we can be appreciative for. And one thing is that it can allow us to really dig deeper with those that we are spending it with. And so ultimately, with all of this, there's a lot for everybody to process and think about and decide. There's a lot of decisions to be made. And in our real life outside of work, these decisions aren't being made for us. We're having to come to terms with them, with our family, and kind of see what are we landing on, what are we arriving on. And that can feel really stressful. But ultimately, putting these protocols into place that Dave was talking about, of being mindful of what these triggers are, thinking back to in the past, what has caused us to derail before, what has caused these wellness initiatives we had in place to unravel, and what do we need to do differently this year?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
really fortifying ourselves going into it. Anything else that you want to share as kind of a outgoing message for people as they're maybe going to listen to this podcast and say, okay, let me make that phone call with family and let's figure out what our game plan is?
Again, I want to just try to, encourage people to think about, hopefully the travails, the hardships, the difficulties that we've had to endure through this year can really help us to remember why the holidays are important. Help us get to that deeper meaning, so to speak, of why we feel the need for community and to gather, and to make that time more memorable, and to hopefully help us rejuvenate as we head into the new year, which is unfortunately going to be another difficult year. But hopefully the holidays in 2021 will have a much different feel than they do this year.
So looking ahead, staying positive, look to identify and really look inside of ourselves. What are those triggers that have pulled me off track? And then what are the healthy parts of my routine, whether it's physical movement, my relationship with food, my relationship with alcohol? What are the healthy parts of my lifestyle and my routine that I need to make sure I'm protecting as much as possible? All right.
Exactly.
Really, really appreciate it. I will be linking to these things that we've talked about. And I really appreciate your guidance and your insight, because this is definitely, I think you called it in our, when we were talking kind of offline before, this is a super stressor of a holiday. And we get it. And our fears and our apprehension it's definitely valid. And so, and we get it. And we hope that this has been helpful for our listeners too. And so a huge thank you for your time. This is holidays like I think many of us have never experienced before. And as you said, the year leading up to this really has us in a delicate, kind of precarious position going into it. So I think the timing on this is fantastic. I know it's beneficial for me hearing this going into the holidays. So I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks, Molly. Thanks again for having me.
So to recap some of the key elements of Dr. Galarneau's message, it's more important than ever now to explore, to look into ourselves and really ask ourselves, and we may not like the answer, but what are those triggers for us? What are those people, places, and or things that he was talking about that can lead us off path? And in past holidays, if we're not able to think about it right now, what was that in past holidays? Because if it did it before, history can often repeat itself. And a little bit of self-exploration, or in some cases, it may be a lot of self-exploration, can help to prevent us from making these same mistakes over and over and over again. These triggers, again, we may not like what we're identifying as what these triggers are, what brings negativity into our world. What are those people, places, things? Sometimes they might be things that are people or things that are very close to us. But identifying these as triggers, as hard as that might be, and realizing that these triggers can leave us feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, angry, helpless, fearful, or for lack of a better word, stressed. And so whatever that negative feeling is that we're experiencing, it can be tempting to self-soothe with food or alcohol. This self-soothing, though, as we've talked about, can quickly turn into self-sabotage, undermining those well-established healthy behaviors that we've worked so diligently to implement. So one of the most tried and true strategies that we can implement to insulate ourselves from those holiday stressors is routine. And so I can't say it enough. I know Dr. Galarneau talked through this, but I want to kind of leave us with this note: maintaining our usual routine as much as possible, staying consistent with what we know works. Holidays, they can throw us a curveball. We know they're going to throw us a curveball. They are going to limit our already tight free time. So start by identifying the strongest aspects of your daily routine that you really want and really need to work to protect. It might be your morning walk, your evening yoga, your protein-rich breakfast, or even simply going to bed at your usual time, trying to make sure that happens as much as possible. Because when things start to unravel a bit, and inevitably they will, these are the behaviors that, as much as possible, are your non-negotiables. So again, I am so honored and grateful to Dr. David Galarneau for joining us today. I always learn from him, and I hope that you did too. And as mentioned, I'll include the links that we mentioned in the show notes of this episode, and keep me posted as you incorporate some of these strategies into your own life. I always love to hear about it. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.